Any thoughts on what's going on? Freedom of the subject and the administration of truth. Anything strike you from this this part?
What is he talking about when he talks love so much?
Love.
Like, why is love so important? I can never really get it.
What's love got to do with it?
Yeah, exactly.
What's love got to do with it? Got to do with it. Great. Any takers? Why is love so important? Anyone want to venture to answer that? Well, it's sort of a trick question, at least according to my analysis. And here's why I think it's not exactly a trick question, but what Balthasar is trying to argue is, and he's been doing this over the last two chapters, but it becomes very clear now. Love is the central logos. It's the central logic of knowledge. So that knowledge finds its actual account within the contours, within the explanatory purview of love. So the relationship between the knower and the known, the relationship between the subject and the object, the relationship of the object to himself, the subject to himself, what one is trying to do when one's trying to understand, what one's trying to do when one is trying to be understood, is, I think, most clearly accounted for within the context of love, I think is what he's trying to say. And now, someone might say, well, why is that? Like, why is that the case? And this is why I thought it's somewhat of a trick question. Not that you were trying to trick us or anything, but the reason it's a difficult question to answer and maybe impossible to answer is because I think he's trying to place love at such a fundamental level that it becomes like the explanatory bedrock of knowledge, and you can't explain it in terms of something else. It's that in virtue of, it's like a explanatory first principle. I guess you could think of it in those terms. It is that in virtue of which other phenomena, not necessarily like the phenomena noumena stuff from Kant, but other realities, other things get accounted for in terms of love, and whether that is true, or whether or not love is the explanatory bedrock of the other transcendentals. This is another way to maybe put it, is that the transcendentals, truth, especially what he's dealing with here, but you can think of it as goodness and beauty, all find their interconnection, their intermingling in the context of love, and various, not necessarily aspects of love, but various approaches to love, various ways in which you approach what love is. It has to be knowing. It has to, and so therefore love has to be true. It has to be good. It has to be beautiful. And so I think you have these are various ways of trying to get a better, clearer sense of the that more fundamental reality, which is love. So I think that's why he transitions to love, and he uses some examples, although they're not super concrete in regards to like silly, mundane, everyday things. But he uses some examples to try to elucidate that when we think about knowledge of truth outside the context of love, it's a truth that is separated from goodness, or it can be separated from goodness. And if it's a truth that's separated from goodness, although he doesn't put it that way explicitly, but I think this is what he has in mind when he's talking about prudence, it's a truth that's not really at the service of the truth, at the fullness of truth, and so he's concerned that people that seek to know the truth outside the context of love are really seeking to use the truth for some other purpose. And once you do that, it becomes a wolf in sheep's clothing. Yeah, technically everything you're saying is true. But what you're really communicating with those true words is something that's not true, because it's divorced from reality, it's divorced from goodness, and so I think love is where all of that gets unified, and so it sort of saves the character of truth, because otherwise it becomes somewhere he puts it as truth isn't mere facts. Truth isn't a fact, right? That's I think for Balthasar, and I think for the tradition, this is very important. I once read in Gabriel Marcel's Gifford Lectures, The Mystery of Being. He's reflecting on truth, what is truth, and he says the classical definition of truth is the adequation of the mind with reality. And he says, but that can't be the end of the story, because no one would die for the adequation of mind to reality. Although that's an accurate description, there's got to be more to the story to it. That's not he thinks sufficient to sacrifice one's life to it. It doesn't. It's an incomplete way of describing it. Not that it's an incorrect way. It's just only part of the story. And to treat it as the full story, I think, is to separate it from love, and therefore it's to separate it from what truth really amounts to. Which is why when you think about the philosopher traditionally, classically, as a lover, the philosopher is a lover, and it's a lover of wisdom. And a lot of what Balthasar is doing here, I think, corresponds with it's actually a good contrast with what we were looking at in the early modern period, which is this emphasis on trying to have accuracy. And what's crazy about what's happening in this section is accuracy is important, but even if what you say and what you do is not accurate, and therefore in one way it's false, it could still be at the service of the true. And this is almost the modus operandi of every Platonic dialogue, right? There's maybe I don't know, for every good argument in a Platonic, like sound argument in a Platonic dialogue, there's probably 10 unsound arguments, and you wonder, why is that? What's the point of all these bad arguments? Is it just that Plato didn't see that these were bad arguments, and we, the perceptive reader, can read this and realize, oh yeah, no, these are bad arguments. Plato just didn't see it. Or was it the case that he was trying to show something else with the endeavor, even in light of the bad arguments, right? And I think what Balthasar is trying to say in this section is the false, taken properly, the false isn't at odds with the true. Just as there's nothing contrary to being, right? There's nothing outside of being right? It's not like you have being that's like outside of being that we call non-being, and here's the beings that's non-being, and here are the beings that are being. So in a sense, there's nothing that's really, in the sense of like, the realness of something. It's not opposed to or contrary to being. In virtue of being and truth being convertible, you can say the same thing about the false. There's nothing really that's contrary or opposed to the true. The false isn't real in a way. So the false is more fundamentally, I think, at the service of the truth. And this is, you can say the same thing about the relationship of good to evil. Evil's not really real in a sense. Evil only makes sense in light of piggybacking off of the good. It's like the shadow of the good in a way. And the same thing with the false, and the same thing with non-being. And I think this is why saying false things is not inconsistent in the transcendental meaning of the word with the true. Just as saying true things might actually be more in line with the false. You know what I'm talking about? Does that make sense? Truth can deceive, and I think what Balthasar is saying is just as the truth can deceive, the false can conceive, receive. It would be undeceive. Yeah.
Give an example of something like that, because the only thing I can think of is like mythology.
Yeah.
Being not a true story, but portrays true.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be a good example. I think like mythology would be a good example of that. That would be, I think, an example where false things, in one sense of false, like in a literal sense, convey something true. I've not read this, but I've heard it referenced stuff that I think is it Chesterton or is it Tolkien or someone talking about fiction, and there's a sense in which like all fiction is when it's good, it's really revelatory of what's real, what's true, and so the meaning of fiction is in not a better understanding of some alternative false fantasy world, but the point of fiction is a better understanding of the real world. And that's the point. That's the point of fiction. I think in a slightly different avenue, I think the various senses of how you read Scripture also can come into play here. That I remember reading one of Gregory of Nyssa's commentaries on the Song of Songs, and he's commenting on this one part about something like honey is, there's a scientific view at the time in Egypt or something that honey like induces sleep, and so it kind of calms or whatever. I forget exactly how it is, and so he comments on this thing about this part in the Song of Songs where honey's on the lips and yada yada. It's kind of to calm, and I forget all the details of it because it's been a while now. And then he says, but that's not true. Like he goes to this long detail of trying to show how this theory, this scientific theory, doesn't call it that, but it's this view of what honey does, and he uses that to comment on Scripture and the meaning of Scripture, and he's sort of paralleling it. And then he says, but that's not actually what like honey does. And one initial reaction is, well, why did you say that then? Why did you comment on Scripture in light of that if it wasn't true? And I think it's a in that context, I think it's a fruitful, helpful image that finds its real expression in a spiritual meaning. So it's kind of like whether or not the physical theories actually are true or not, they can be used to communicate almost like a myth, something more meaningful. which is a lot of times how the spiritual interpretation proceeds. I mean, in the opposite direction, I mean, it can happen. I mean, I know people that it's a very common way of arguing. Actually, this is probably the heart of all of the wise, sort of in a pejorative sense, heretics who will take words, particular passages of Scripture, and in an isolated way, cutting that off and treating it a partial assertion of truth, treating it as like the whole. It kind of corrupts it in a way. It gives it a significance or a tone that it doesn't have. And I mean, this happens oftentimes. People will take a passage of, a church father, or take a passage of this, and then it'll be thought to be an isolated thing. But when you do that, you realize there's statements that various church fathers make that, taken individually, seem a lot like, or maybe even almost close to verbatim, Arian, at the surface level. And so you're like, how could Athanasius be saying this or whatever? I don't know about kind of historical theology here, but there's cases of this where, you would think that what this person was saying was exactly what this person is saying, because on the level they're the exact same words. If this person says those words, surely they mean the same thing that this person says when they say those words. But that's not always the case, and it's kind of like to know what one is saying requires seeing what one is trying to say. It's almost like what one is trying to say is more fundamental than what one actually says. And how do you know what one is trying to say? Only within the context of like a trajectory of effort, which is largely what distinguishes the faithful Christian who makes mistakes theologically, so they say heretical things, but that doesn't make them a heretic because they say heretical things, because they weren't trying to depart or to change. It was not the goal of this. So you kind of have to see what is the trajectory of assertion. So I mean, there's cases like that in theological contexts. It happens all the time when you talk to children. They'll say things that don't make sense, and you can either say, which sometimes I do because I'm a bad person. I don't say it out loud. I say it in my head. You don't know anything. You're an idiot. Something like that. Well, that's kind of harsh, but it's kind of how I feel sometimes. Or you can try to make sense out of what they're saying, such that you're presupposing that they have a meaning that they don't fully know how to articulate or even fully understand, although they're trying to understand it. You can help them come to this understanding in light of what they're trying to say. This happens in students asking questions. Sometimes students think they need to have a real good formulation of a question before they ask the question. But that's just idiocy. That's just stupid because, well, at least if you're in my class, because that's not how I am. I don't know what I'm going to say. I sort of know what I am going to try to say in that more fundamental sense, but it's always, at least for me, and this is the experience for a lot of people when they're asking questions, it's certainly the experience for children, you're at a loss for words with how to communicate ideas. The goal of education is to have these words so that you can, come to a better formulation of this, so that you can have a better communication, which is, a truer communication. It's a truer act because it's a more disclosive act of oneself. So if my children were a little more articulate, they could be a little more disclosive of what what they have in mind. But I think there's also a sense in the fact that maybe a student raises their hand and asks a question and stumbles and fumbles through how to frame it. That's disclosive of something also. It's not as articulate, but it's disclosive of something about them, right? Namely, there's an earnestness. I mean, even if it's an earnestness and wanting to understand this for the sake of getting, a better grade on an exam or something, but it's an earnestness that's going to say, or that says, how I frame this question is secondary to the attempt to frame the question, and so I don't know, and that is something that you can recognize. It's like the complete buffoon. People like watching this in like those stupid chick flick movies where you have like the high school boy who makes a fool of himself trying to like show his love for his neighbor or whatever. I don't know, the chick flick scenarios since like the early 90s. But you have sort of the idiocy, the fumbling around, the embarrassment, and all that in some sense becomes disclosive. Where if this guy was perfectly well put together, had everything perfectly, said and arranged, you wouldn't get that. You maybe get something else that was good, but you don't get that that just vulnerable honesty being disclosed. So I think whether it's disclosed in an articulate way or something's disclosed in an articulate way or not, the fact is every action is a disclosure of something. It's a disclosure of someone's. Or let's just say it's a disclosure of truth, which is what truth is, right? It's true. It's a true act. Does that make sense? Yeah.
This is changing the topic, if that's okay.
Yeah. No, that's great. I like changing the topics. I can only stay on a song for too long. So I do this on Spotify all the time. I change artists.
I don't exactly know what page it's on. It's like
What paragraph does it begin with?
six pages before the end of chapter 2. Love not only sets a limit to its own revelations.
Okay.
Yeah. So it says, love not only sets a limit to its own revelations, but also respects the mystery of the other person. It is not in love's nature to wheedle truth out of another's intimate space or to extort a confession from him. Of course, there are cases in which a just love requires such a confession, for example, in the higher good of the commonwealth as a state, but perhaps also in order to heal the person who confesses. I was just wondering if you could talk more about that and what he's trying to get at. That was really beautiful.
Yeah.
If you can find it.
Yeah, I think I found it. Maybe over break I'll try to paginate and correlate the pages so we can all easily reference. Okay, so
Is it under B or C?
this is under the Administration of Truth section. Yeah, so okay, so love not only sets a limit to its own revelations, but also respects the mystery of the other person. It is not in love's nature to whittle truth out of another's intimate space or to extort a confession from him. I think what he's trying to say is the exact opposite of what we saw in Descartes' discourse, which is the point of man is to be like the masters and possessors of nature. The reason is to like extract truth. It's like a truth syringe, and you extract truth out of things. And it's this capacity of reason. Reason is this capacity. It's this like vacuum that can suck up these things and make sense out of them and put them to use. And I think what he's trying to say is that, especially in regards to, I think the context he has in all of this at this stage is intersubjectivity, so it's between subjects. But I don't think it necessarily has to be at that domain, although it's most clear there. So I think that's where that's where the discussion takes place. So you don't want to think about let's try to use just a concrete example, even if it's maybe a little off the mark, but we'll try to hone it in. So if you're having a conversation with someone you know is a real, Platonist, they just love Plato, you can find yourself taking that into consideration and using that to structure your conversation with them. And that's not in and of itself a bad thing. So things you'll say certain things to a Platonist that you wouldn't say to, I don't know, a Kantian or something. Right? This is just in a philosophical context. You can pick other figures you want. And I think the idea, you could even, things you would say to a Republican you wouldn't say to a Democrat. Maybe you'd put it a little bit different way. Maybe you wouldn't be so over the top and free with it. I don't know. So you can pick whatever sort of divides you want. I think what Balthasar is up to in this context is the goal of truth. The point of truth is communication. It's, literally the unification of the subject and the object. It's that type of indwelling that we saw in that first chapter, chapter 1. And what you don't want to happen in a fruitful conversation or communication, which is often what happens, is you kind of put on a hat that you don't actually, quote, wear, or that's not really yours, and you sort of speak in the lingo and say things according to the ideology of this or that for the sake of conversation. But it becomes then sort of like platitudes. It becomes kind of surface level. Even if you're talking about, quote, deep things like, being in the forms and the separation of the forms, or you could, it could be, you could think of it in terms of, two people of the same thought, like two Thomists, let's say, talking. What I think Balthasar is trying to say is, a lot of times the things that we say, the actions that we do, you can think of things that you say are just a type of action. So this what goes for words or speaking goes for every action. So this is not unique to just speech, but speech is an instance of action. It's a unique type of action, a unique type of communication. But all action is communication for the tradition. And I think what you have experienced, but you also realize there's got to be something deeper, or else there's really nothing to conversation. That if you just speak as a broad general Thomist and they speak as a broad general Thomist, you might be saying a lot of true things, but it kind of doesn't really get to the core, right? Because you're just still talking at the level of like ideas or abstraction, which is all true stuff, but it's not the real active communication of one individual to another individual. Okay, within this particular context of it doesn't demand, or you have an extortion of this confession from another person. You want the other person to speak their mind, you just put it that way, or to speak what they think. But but you don't want to do it in such a way that you don't want to bring that about in such a way that it like takes it out of their hands, such that you like force them to say certain things. And I think what Balthasar is saying is once you do that, the whole point of communication, the whole point of them speaking that in the first place or thinking it in the first place is now like out of significance. It loses its significance. Another way to put this, I guess, it would be to treat the subject as an object. It's in the not in the Balthasarian sense of object, but in the sense of object as just like maybe like a Cartesian sense of object. It's just there for you to like, some truths you can get by looking, the color of things. Other truths you can get by doing a little scientific experiment on them. Other truths you can get by having a conversation with them. And so you think about what a conversation is just sort of like cracking them open so as to see what they think. It's like a mental experiment on them. And you're talking to them to try to crack them open to see what they think. And I think that that loses the point, I guess, of truth. It loses what and this is within the context of love. It makes truth not an act of love. It makes it an act of, like, I don't know, stealing. It's kind of, put it this way, it's like on Christmas morning, there's your gift sitting under the tree. To think of your gift as something that's just there for you to take, is to think of it not really as a gift at all. It's just brute goods for acquisition. And a lot of kids, myself included, that's how I thought of Christmas morning, was just like the time to get goods. They weren't really gifts. It was this expectation of acquiring something. And it took away, I think, the significance of that, the very existence of that Hot Wheels set in the first place, right? I mean, like, the whole point of that wasn't merely just, the redistribution of goods from Santa Claus, because that's who gave me gifts when I was a kid. I don't know, but it was probably your guys' parents or something. But Santa Claus was the one that gave me gifts, and me, right? And you think, like, that's the point of this. It's just the distribution of goods. But I think thinking of that context in that way, and thinking of it in terms of a gift, changes that act very significantly. I mean, it would be like saying, I'm bringing my wife flowers, or no, let's use a better example, avocados. Yesterday was her birthday, and I gave her a bowl of avocados for her birthday, because this was something that she loves, guacamole. So sort of, it was a potential gift, because I had to actualize it later. But it was a big bowl of avocados. And if I did that merely because, and I'm a work in progress, like all of us. So the part of me was like, I have to get my wife something, and so there was this sense of obligation, in a way, probably like many of us respond to the fact that it's someone's birthday. You feel like you have to do something. But there's also this other part of you, because we're not all so bad as to not have any small bit of love in us. We also want to use that as an occasion of communicating our love for that person, and so you try to figure out what's the best gift to give this. But if I merely thought of it as, I have to do this because I'm her husband, and this is what good husbands do, and I'm following this law, and that it's not, as Balthasar puts in the paragraph before, it becomes outside of the law of love. It's the act means something very different, I think, is what he's trying to say. And the same thing with, like, the reception of someone's conversation. Like if someone confides in you something that's really painful in their life, really really tragic, and you're sitting there receiving it merely because you're like, well, I can't leave the room now. Like that would be really awkward to get up and leave. And now that they're pouring their heart open to me, so I'll just sit here and let them share with me, and maybe I'll do it out of just the brute politeness of things. That's a very different action. And I think even in a sense, the meaning of what that other person's doing is changed in virtue of the action that I have in receiving that. So I think it's not merely, doing something, truth understood as this communication, but it's also the reception of the communication of another. And I think you can't extort it. You can't make it happen. Just as you can't make a good conversation happen. Like you can't make force someone else into a good conversation. Let's have a meaningful conversation where we share our hearts with each other. And the other person's like, okay. Right? It's only going to go so far. And I think you might think, well, no, we can get to the heart of this person by, and as Balthasar puts it at the end of that paragraph, by like hypnosis or something. You go to the extreme. Or you could think of, you trick them or you deceive them or something. Now you know their heart because you've placed them in this context. I think he's saying you've lost the truth of what was there by the fact that you've extorted or you've taken away. Just as you've lost the goodness of the gift by stealing it or taking it, right? Yeah, you got the train set, but you lost the real goodness of the train set, which was not the wood and the wheels and the little, train whistle noise. It was the expression of love, the communication of love that has, and you lose that by taking it. And I think he's saying something similar within the context of truth. So what goes for the context of goodness, I think, is in the context of truth here. You can't force someone to speak truthfully to you, honestly. Even if they say all the truth, they speak truly to you in the surface level. It's very different from freely doing it. Does that? And it's hard to articulate. It seems sort of all kind of hippie, but it seems hippie only because hippies really liked love, and this is the context of love. Even if there's something a little bit true within the context of the 60s. That's, you can even concede that, right? The centrality of love. I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but that's I think what he has in mind in that.
So is it always about like the intention? I'm thinking of like Saint Paul when he talks talks to the people about the unknown God, which he is talking like from their point of view, kind of like what you were saying earlier, but his intention would be very different than a lot of other people's.
Yeah, I think intention plays a role. A lot of what Balthasar's up to, and we need to go to the beginning of the section here in a bit, but we'll finish this, and we'll try to bring it back to the beginning of the freedom of the subject section. But a lot of this is not subsequent to it. So I think what he's trying to say is prior to any particular act of knowing or particular act of communication, there's an originary, a primal disposition, you could call it, or openness or will. It's like a willingness prior to any act of the will, an openness prior to any act of like receiving something. That's in place. And so I think to talk about it as lying in the intention, I think is sort of true, but it's an intention that's a very open intention that doesn't have any real goal. So think about like a conversation with a friend. You almost don't care where that goes or how it goes, or if this is going to be a conversation where I'm going to look like an idiot. Sometimes those are good conversations too, especially if it's among friends. Okay, I look like a complete idiot. I mean, now this is a conversation about making fun of this stupid thing that I did in high school. Okay, that's what this is about. It doesn't so much call the shots in advance. That's kind of a secondary down the road analogy of what's happening in a more primary way in this freedom of the subject. The subject is so free that it can be led anywhere. There's nowhere where it can't be led. And this is I think dramatically articulated in Plato's dialogues, where you don't have a sense that Socrates cares where the conversation goes. He's like a complete wanderer. He's a sojourner. He's not looking to get to one particular end. Because the real question is, where the heck should I be going in the first place, right? Like that's sort of the challenge of truth. It's this admission that you're not the master of it, and the subject's role is the free response that's in obedience to whatever's disclosed in the object. And so I think it's that type of openness or freedom that precedes anything. And so intention, I think, is true, but it's an intention that is so fundamental that it doesn't restrain anything. Which is why I think he goes on to talk about that the subject doesn't have to hide or put it this way: the object doesn't have to be afraid with what it reveals to the subject, and so it's like, oh, I'm only going to reveal these good aspects, or I'm only going to communicate in the proper way, because otherwise the subject won't like what I have to say or communicate. But the free subject is so free, so desirous of the true, that it can take everything, it receives everything, and as he says, it has the ability to look over, to gloss over, to forget. There's sort of a lovingness in the subject manifested in its forgetfulness. I know you said this in this way, and I can really hold that against you for a long period of time. But the whole point of this wasn't exactly how you said it. It was in what you were trying to say and this broader context. And I can look over that. And if you ever go become a teacher or a parent or a human being, you'll have to do this in life. That you have to learn to just let the way that people speak or the way that people act. You kind of have to let that go and look deeper or beyond it. So it's a type of forgetfulness which is not a naive one. So he's trying to contrast it with this naive openness. So it's an intention to love the object as the object is, which paints the object in the best light without it being I'm looking at this with rose-colored glasses. Right? That's not at all. That wouldn't be true. If you look at if you say, oh, I want to see the best in this person, and so you ignore certain aspects of them because you don't want them to be like that. That's not exactly what Balthasar is, I think, saying. That would not be a true understanding of them. A true understanding of them would be one which completely recognizes them for all their faults, but it almost doesn't hold those faults against them. It can see deeper than those faults, and so it looks over them. The analogy I had, and I've used in other classes, it's a completely different context, but it's a fruitful way of, I think, putting the forgetfulness that's needed if you're going to be a free subject. When you're reading a book, what are you looking at when you're reading a book? It's sort of sort of a rhetorical question, but not really. I'm actually looking for people to answer. What are you looking at when you're reading a book? Most, like, at the simplest, most basic level. No, you're not. No, even more basic.
Paper and ink.
Paper and ink, right? You're looking at paper and ink. Okay, and you show this to a baby. You show this to a dog. You show this to, I don't know, a baby dog. Then you have this same. There's the same thing there, right? It's the same object, right? Paper and ink is there, but in order to see the book as more than paper and ink, because you can see it as more than paper and ink, you have to move past or move beyond, or you have to forget that you're looking at ink, right? What do you mean forget looking at ink? Do you have to pretend, or like you have to get over the fact, over the focus, right? Part of what he's saying here is this is the freedom that the subject has. The subjects can make this decision in a way to focus on something rather than something else, and it's a focus that doesn't. It's not a deceiving focus, but it's a focus on something that's better, more true, more meaningful than something else. Ink might be meaningful, but there might be more meaningful things on the page than ink. And the only way to get to that is if you can, quote, forget the ink and focus on letters. But there's more meaningful things than letters on this page too, right? Your kindergartner might be able to spot the letters, and so they're at a higher. They're living in a higher world. There's a higher world of truth that they're in than the dog. But the child needs to also learn to forget the letters. I mean, you can get distracted by the font. Sometimes this is what people like to do when they're in like 5th grade, typing up papers. They like to change the font to these cute little cursive fonts, and it makes it seem a little more like erudite when you have these like curvy letters and things, and you change the font color. I don't know why that's supposed to make it more erudite, but people tend to think it does, right? And so you change all this stuff, but that's like to get distracted by lower things. It's to get distracted in the letters, and you need to, when you're reading attentively, you need to forget the letters. You even need to forget the words, that is, the written words on the page. This is a type of abstraction that's not an abstraction that moves you from reality, but it's an abstraction that lets you more properly see what is before you. You kind of need, in order to properly understand what someone is saying when they're speaking to you, you need to stop focusing on that little hum. You can be quiet, you can listen to it. It's not really a hum, it's more of a fan swish, right? And this can happen. You can get sucked into focusing on these little noises, sometimes clock ticks and things. You've got to let those things go. They're there, but you gotta let them go if you're really going to focus on what someone is saying. And I think that's an analogy that, or maybe not even an analogy. That's just an example, an instance of the freedom of the subject. We can do that. We can make that decision to do it. It takes some training. It takes some discipline to do that. But you can do that. That's what it is to be a free subject. It's to be able to focus your ability to know. And one necessary precondition for focusing is by forgetting, but not a forgetting, once again, that is an ignoring in the sense that it's completely gone, right? The ink isn't completely gone when you're focusing on the meaning of the chapter, right? The ink's still there. You need the ink, actually. If you don't have ink, you're not going to have a book to read. But you need to focus on some aspect of ink that's deeper. And I think that's really at the heart of this chapter, or at least this section on the freedom of the subject. And that's such a fundamental originary way of being a human being that it affects and it's like a filter on all of your subsequent acts of knowing. Right? Like if you're a resentful person or you're a prideful person and you hear someone say something that slightly sounds stupid, you're gonna get hung up on that, and it's going to cause you to stall, and you're going to get stuck on a partial truth. But it's going to become a partial truth that's just cut off from the true, because it's to actually focus on something that ought to be left behind in the way that you're reading the text and you get stuck on the fact that the ink didn't print really well. This happens, right, on a book. The print, and it's like faded ink, and you're like, what word is this? And it causes you to slow down, and you have to think of it, and you're like, darn printers, Ignatius Press, why didn't you change your ink cartridge before you? And you get like, it's disruptive. But you can just make that decision to plow through, because there's bigger fish to fry than to get angry at that here, right? There's something more meaningful, and that small little blip is not something to be thought of as the meaning of this, and you have to sort of move past that. And I think that's what Balthasar's up to, and that's why love is necessary. Because if you're not a loving person, you won't do that. You'll see these blips, you'll see these faded ink splashes, and you'll just get pissed off, and it'll cause you to lose your train of thought, which is to step back from the truth, from the disclosure that's being enacted. I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe it does. Any questions about any of this stuff at the beginning? So we kind of spiraled back to what I wanted to talk about. Hopefully it was somewhat seamless, but that's what the freedom of the subject is, and that's what I think he has that's what's, I don't know, the first 4 pages of this section is about that. Anything from any of these passages? Yeah, Jaden.
I think just to add on to what you're saying, something that I really liked was how it ultimately, the goal is to conform the way we see things, like the way God sees things.
Yeah.
And like it reminded me of the story of the soul.
Uh-huh.
How Saint Therese, like the way she saw others and the way she loved others was like loving them in God, and like as God loves them. And he kind of touches at the very last paragraph of right before the administration of the complete. He talks about that. He says, in order to do so, you have to have learned better to have received from God the grace to love and to contemplate Him in God Himself, the original source and the image of knowledge and the image of love coincide. Which I think is just really beautiful.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, that's great, because like I think everything we're saying about subject and object can be said in an analogous way about like God and the soul.
Yeah.
Because for us, if our knowledge is like a sort of active creative love, I mean, how much more is the perfectly spontaneous knowing that even Kant was talking about?
Yeah. And this is in book 10 or 11 of Augustine's Confessions. He starts that book by quoting one of the Psalms, but the way he quotes the Psalms is he kind of quotes and he slightly changes it a little bit, sort of like a creative quoting. And he says, may I know, the confession is addressed to God, right? It's basically this work addressed to God. And he says, may I know you, my knower, even as I myself am known by you, which is it's like the first sentence of this book. And I think at this stage in Augustine's thought, he's at least in the Confessions, he's saying something that corresponds to this and to these 2 comments, which I think is very helpful, which is what created truth most fundamentally what created truth is a communication of uncreated truth. It's the idea that creation is God's revelation of himself. It's like, not that you have creation and then you have various ways that God reveals himself in creation. It's that creation is a revelation of God. I think then a knowledge of creation is going to be a participation in a knowledge of the Creator or the uncreated, and so one's intelligibility is then most fundamentally to be known or to be seen within the mind of God. It's almost like to know yourself as known by God. It's like the object. If the oak tree, if the oak tree were conscious, it would. If it were conscious, it wouldn't have to say this. It's a bad example, but let's just say if it were conscious, but it weren't conscious also. This is maybe a bad example because we're trying to think about something that's not conscious as if it were. Anyway, let me make the point. The tree said, "May I be known by you, human, and it's in being known by you that I am like most fundamentally or most truly known." It's so the tree's understanding of itself is not in itself, right? The tree's real, true understanding of itself is in the one that knows it most perfectly. And so I think the relationship of the tree to the human is analogous to the relationship of the soul to God. What we do in creation, and he says this a little bit when he makes reference to analogy and secondary causality. This is towards the end. This is in the administration of truth. And I think one way to think of the administration of truth title is we are ministers in a sense of truth. There's a role that we play, just in light of what he said earlier about what truth is. There's a role that we play. Perceivers play a role in perception. Knowers play a role in truth. But we play this role in a secondary, participatory, causal way. And what we're doing is what God is. Or actually, no, it's the very end of the freedom of the subject section. It's the third paragraph, second paragraph from the end, something like that. The one that begins, "God alone primarily possesses knowledge." A few lines down, "God's knowledge is generative of truth. It is pure spontaneity without admixture of any receptivity in relation to the things he knows." And we saw Solace make this point about this is what Kant says in his early work. The truth that his knowledge posits in being is the measure of the truth of things. Right? So it's not that God needs to receive things, and truth is found in the reception of things as they are, but it's a type of a knowing that's a making, a knowing that's constitutive of the truth of things. And he says then, in a crazy way, in the next sentence, human knowledge can never be archetypal, right? We're never going to be able to do what God actually does, in the absolute sense. Yet the law of analogy of being and secondary causality implies that God allots to the creature something of his creative power, even in the domain of truth. So just as humans can, in the domain of goodness, we're not good in the fullest sense of good, but we can participate in goodness, and we can participate in the diffusiveness of the good, right? So we carry on the act of the good in a way, in a created way. Analogously, we carry on that creative act of the truth of God's knowledge in knowing things. And we already made a little bit of reference to this when we were talking about solace, that therefore there's some role that the human plays that's not just a receptive role in truth, but it's a spontaneous role. And I think the way Balthasar is putting this here is this spontaneous role is ultimately in a loving of the object, which lets the object be what it really is in its fullness. To be receptive of someone who is having a conversation with you, to listen to them, is to bring that individual as a speaker into fullness. It perfects them as a speaker. It doesn't just, it's not just, okay, I'm going to be a good listener now. That doesn't just perfect you, but it perfects them as a speaker. And so in some ways, you do participate in the creation of that individual as a speaker. If all of you left the room, I wouldn't be a teacher anymore, or at least an active teacher. Maybe I'm not even an active teacher now. But, right, if you all left the room, I wouldn't be an active teacher. So in some ways, your presence here, you're listening, you're paying attention, if that's what's happening. I imagine it is, I think it is, I hope it is. This is also one of the aspects, is that there's a degree of faith and hope that's in the context of the truth, right, that needs to be there. But my being what I am then depends on you. It partly relies on you in a way, and that's the degree to which you participate in the creation of what I am and what I'm actively doing right now. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, and I think ultimately then it's a way of seeing the response that we have to creation ought to be understood within the ideal of what God is doing in relation to us. And if God's knowledge of us is more fundamentally not just this, let me exhibit my awesomeness of understanding and that generates another, but it's actually a knowledge it's a love, right? If God's knowledge most fundamentally is understood in terms of love, then our knowledge of created truths would have to then be understood in the same form, the form of love. It's created love, but it's still understood in that same guise. So yeah, I think this is a good way to kind of bridge that, or to make that transition between the freedom of the subject and the administrators of truth. We do at the created order, in the created world, what God does in an uncreated fashion, I guess you could say, in the generation or the creation of things. We do at the level of secondary creation. We're sort of like secondary creators, which is kind of crazy to put it that way. It's not entirely creation, but it's akin to it. It's analogous to it. Right? There's a way in which reading a book makes words, in a sense, right? It makes the book, it makes this thing have meaning. If you lost readers, you would kind of lose written words. So it's yeah. Anything else? Feel free to change the Spotify channel. We can move on to the next theme. If anyone has something else that's struck them, we don't have too much time. But any final thoughts or remarks on this?
I really liked the way you explained how Balthasar talks about looking past the faults of communication object.
Yeah.
And the subject having radical freedom to do that, because it actually really helped me understand, at least I think a little bit better, what Aristotle means when he's talking about abstracting in essence from a sense-to-sense data.
Yeah.
Because I can say abstract, but that didn't really have any content for me before I read this.
Yeah.
That really helped, actually.
Yeah, and this is why, I mean, this is just a little hobby horse I like to get to that. I am dubious of certain what I like to call sort of, I shouldn't like to call it because it's sort of, but I like to call kind of burnt toast readings of Plato. It's kind of like dry, crispy, like, I don't know, sometimes also people call it flat-footed, right? Where what he's talking about, the separation of the soul from the body, and he uses the term separation a lot. I think one of the ways you could think about separation is as abstraction. It's a removal, a type of removal, but a removal doesn't necessarily have to be spatial. You don't have to separate the words from the letters in a spatial sense. In fact, you can't do that. You put the letters over here and the words over there, and you're going to sort of be left puzzled. So the separation is, or the abstraction is one that doesn't occur like in a spatial way, and so I think there's a nuance. There's a subtlety in Plato when he's talking about the separation of the body from the soul. Where it's not like the soul's just got to get the heck out of Dodge and get out of that body thing. You might say, I need to separate words from letters, and if I can't remove the words from the letters, or abstract the words from the letters, separate words from letters, then the words will be enslaved. And they'll become like the slaves of letters. And I go to read words and I just focus on the letters. And I'm like, oh, wow, what font is this? Oh, that's, I don't know, Wingdings 2019. Oh, you probably wouldn't be able to read Wingdings. But that separation is, I think, understood in terms of like an abstraction. And the thing about abstraction is, it's not inconsistent with the unity, and this is why throughout a lot of the examples that you find in Plato and the examples that you find in a lot of contexts, the universal is like wedded to the particular, but it's only seen as universal when you can separate it in a way, but it's not like like you're severing it with like a bread knife and you're like pulling the universal out of the particular. And so I think the way that Plato talks about this is in a metaphorical sort of spatial sense, but I don't really think that's what he's up to. It actually more has to do with the freedom that's in the subject to focus. It's like to refocus in a way, to reorder. Would be another way to, and that's discipline, and that's why virtue is needed for knowledge, as well. But anyway, that's that. We don't really have much time, but I'll just mention this so that you can think about it over Easter, because we're getting ready to spend some time in front of the scandal of the cross, and why the cross is a scandal, and what Balthasar says about a scandal here. It's taking the closure of the particular, closing it off from the absolute. And there's something about the cross which is scandalous, because it is an end. It's an end of a guy's life. It's an end. And so there it's almost like the height of scandal. But this is why I've heard it said that there's, in another sense, for the Christian, there is nothing that's scandalous, because nothing is cut off really from the universal. It's like it's scandalous when it's like no sin is ever so grave as not to be like a Peter, right? I mean, it's like a Judas, which his sin is like the scandal because it was cut off. But when you see Judas and you see Peter, they're almost very similar, almost interchangeable in a way. But the reason the one is scandalous whereas the other isn't, and in fact it's sort of this great, part of one of the greatest saints' lives, is because Peter's denial is not cut off from the absolute. It becomes the occasion of like this conversion, whereas Judas's scandal is, or Judas's sin is an actual scandal because it severs it. It's the end of the story, right? And